Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So one of my faithful viewers asked for a video about totalitarianism and fascism. Fascism is a word which is bandied around a lot, which is largely coterminous with Nazi. And these are often just used as terms of abuse. I don't like you. Obviously, there's a real meaning, an attempt to delegitimize the other side. It's seldom accurately used. Of course, Putin says he's on a denazification mission in Ukraine, which is yet another outrageous slur. You know, this from the government, which claimed that Zelensky had already fled Ukraine, a blatant lie, as he's proven he's in Ukraine and again and again. Well, I won't get to all the proven lies of the Russian government. But anyway, the word totalitarianism was invented by Benito Amilcare Mussolini, who was a prime minister of Italy from 1921 to 1943. Mussolini, I don't think he quite invented the word fascist, was around slightly before him, but he really popularized it just after the First World War. It comes from fasces, as in bundles of rods that quaestors, these judges in ancient Rome used to hold, or was it lictors? Yes. So the rods individually can easily snapped, but as a bundle, they're strong. So unity is strength, an axe coming out of them, which is indicative of only the state having the right to execute people. So there were fascisti de combattimento in Italy just after the First World War. These various fighting groups when northern Italy was certainly teetering on the brink of an outright civil war between communists and right wingers. Totalitarianism has really only been around since the early 20th century because it requires some level of technology. There were absolutist states prior to that. But I think totalitarianism suggests that you have a mass media in order to be able to disseminate its messages and so on. It's linked with technology a little bit. So totalitarianism, or Mussolini defined as everything within the state, nothing outside the state, which is an exaggeration. It's a misdescription because he did allow free enterprise. There were businesses, there was private ownership, people could pursue the profit motive. There was a large state sector. They believe in propaganda being absolutely crucial and in propagandizing people incessantly. Mussolini later said that fascism is an Italian idea, the Germans will end up ruining it, although briefly the Germans were much more successful with it. And Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Propaganda and Popular Enlightenment of the Third Reich, he said that propaganda's got to be simple, emotional, and endlessly repeated. He thought that the German wartime propaganda had been woeful, far too effete, recherché, references to Albrecht Dürer. The average person wasn't going to recognize the illusion. Italian fascist propaganda, and obviously they co-opted the church concordat with the Roman Catholic Church, well, the Lateran Pact, that was 1929, to have the church not interfering in politics. Remember, this is a country where at least 90% of people call themselves Catholics, a few people non-religious, and a very small number of atheists, Waldensians, as in Protestants, and Jews. But Mussolini said the police is the best example of the state. It's uniformed, it's armed, and it has extensive powers, obviously of arrest, of detention, of stop and search, of raiding people, and really didn't believe in individual rights, setting up his own intelligence agency with a specific mission to enforce an ideology, OVRA, Organizzazione per Vigilanza contra la Resistenza Antifascista. They really praised Prussian virtues. So they cherished the military above all, so quite militaristic, spending a lot on the army, thinking that war is natural, even desirable, as he said, saying that war making is to the male what childbearing is to the female, and believing in gender roles, quite anti-feminist, pursuing natalist policies. Though he's finer generative, this wasn't terribly successful. Aghast to discover that number of senior fascists had no children, some were not married. So they also hell-bent on conquests, an appeal to a semi-mythical past, and then trying to rebuild the Pax Romana. But though the will was strong, the body was weak in this case. They obviously didn't have the military strength of the industrial base to do that. Tried and failed. And you can read a book about Sawdust Caesar, his risible attempt to recreate the Roman Empire. Corporatism, we often say, corporate state. They weren't necessarily against corporations. Now, remember, Mussolini had been a socialist, editor of Il Popolo d'Italia, the most popular socialist newspaper, and some of that never left him. He obviously reverted to type towards the end of his life when he founded La Repubblica Sociale di Salo in the extreme north of Italy. So, saying, well, I don't like the toffs, the aristocracy in the royal family. He'd been an anti-monarchist, of course. Now, one of the things he really changed is how he'd been an anti-patriot, as he said, before the First World War, opposing the war against the Ottoman Empire and the annexation of Libya. So this is nationalism with knobs on. It's not a reasonable, healthy nationalism. It's hyper-nationalism. It's chauvinism. It's not just adulating your own nation, even to a ludicrous degree, but denigrating and detesting others, and having some pseudo-scientific view of racial superiority. Racism is important to it. I mean, he was a white supremacist. Most whites were, even if they weren't malicious ones, just paternalistic ones in those days, and against a lot of other whites as well. So it's very much about being macho and doing these silly, contemptible things like going around with his shirt off a lot of the time, even though he wasn't a particularly fine specimen of manhood. Melodramatic gestures, having the sword of Islam forged for him. It's actually made in Italy, not in any Muslim country. Rather contemptible adolescent posturing. So having no respect for civil liberties whatsoever, and don't need to do things by the book. There's no presumption of innocence. You don't have a fair trial. You can detain people without trial forever. You can have kangaroo courts and farcical trials. You can rig elections, and you absolutely disbelieve in freedom of expression. And because he was a newspaper man, he understood how vital the media were in the modern world. Italy had finally reached full literacy. So propagandizing people as 360-degree propaganda through the radio, through television, through the cinema. They didn't have TV in those days in Italy. But other things, you would see images of Mussolini in every classroom, lecture room, shop, restaurant, bus station, railway station, waiting room, hospital, clinic, office, factory, you name it, it was there. Big posters by the road, and his images, and the lead item in the newspaper quite often, what he'd done or said that day, sometimes even written by him. And these propaganda techniques, they were eagerly emulated by other dictators around the world after that. As well as offering some genuine benefits. He wouldn't have been so popular if he hadn't done a few good things as well as doing evil things. Setting up a club called Dopo Lavoro, as in after work, to people to socialise, to be playing board games, eat and drink, organising excursions and so forth. A few infrastructure projects, making the trains run on time, things like that. So that's what totalitarianism is. Whether it calls itself fascism, but it can be done by communism, or really just about any sort of ism. And obviously a one-party state, trying to make the allegiance to the party and the state the same, believing there's no such thing as loyal opposition, having an unduly broad definition of sedition, of state terror. But to say there was state terror in Mussolini's Italy, certainly in the early days, would not be true. Okay, he had the march in Rome. There'd been quite a lot of violence really up to 1922. He came into office. It's true that Giacomo Andreotti, the Socialist Party leader, was murdered 2 years later. Another thing is salami tactics, as Rákosi Mátyás, the communist dictator of Hungary, called them, just after the Second World War. Mussolini was cunning enough not to do it all at once. You cut it off thin slice, and another, and another, and another. You would do it bit by bit, like the frog that's boiled alive and doesn't jump out because it doesn't notice it. So you take it off in very small increments. So it's much more insidious and invidious and scarcely noticeable, these small usurpations of your liberty. And by the time you wake up to it, well, it's already too late. So it took him about 4 years to phase in totalitarianism. And eventually he banned all the other political parties, and he completely loaded the dice in the electoral system. And then there was only one party. And even having a Grand Council of Fascists as an alternative parliament, all appointed by him. And he'd got the monarch on his side, having previously been anti-monarchy. His name always had to be printed in letters. Often you had to have a triptych displayed, the king, the pope, and Mussolini. And if you didn't like Mussolini, you'd at least like one of the other two. I mean, you think at least 9 out of 10 of Italians must have liked at least one of the three. So some of the prestige of the monarch and the supreme pontiff would rub off on him. So like a new unholy trinity. So quite flexible, Prussian totalitarianism can be expedient. When he recognised his politique to kiss and make up with the House of Savoy, he did so. All right. So yeah, being on the side of the major religious denomination. This is what they always do. Except there are other types of totalitarianisms which you go in further and try to be a quasi-religion. So we come on to communism, which is also totalitarian, even though they're said to be deadly enemies. You'll often find your worst foe is someone quite similar to yourself. As Churchill archly said, communism and fascism are opposite though similar. That there's not a political spectrum, it's a political circle. You go far enough this way, you come all the way around to being the other one. So obviously based on the teachings of Karl Marx, who in some ways was liberal, he didn't call for a one-party state. He'd applauded President Lincoln for abolishing slavery. I don't think he wanted servitude at all. Hadn't wanted to outlaw other points of view. But anyway, Marxism was taken over, and then unfortunately it was implemented in one of the most backward countries in Europe with very low literacy, with a tradition of intolerance, absolute monarchy, and a firm disbelief in the rights of the individual. And so sadly, Marxism was grafted onto a society with that sort of psyche, where many people thought that even if liberal nostra, even if they're desirable and flourish in Occidental countries, they're absolutely inapplicable to Russia. And anyway, so I won't go through exactly what happened, but anyway, communists came to power in Russia from 1917 onwards, built the Soviet Union, and believing that Marxism was applicable to all disciplines in science and so on. But Marxism is a philosophy and it's an economic system, but it really has no corporate view on hard sciences. And that's why Stalin, when he was ruler of the Soviet Union for around 30 years, had these absolute crackpot beliefs and promoted a guy called Trysenko as a proletarian scientist, i.e. someone with no qualifications, who had these ludicrous ideas about like winter corn and so on. And they thought that Marxism had been scientifically proven and therefore it could not possibly be erroneous. There was the infallibility of Marxism, and anything proved to be fallacious was heretical, had to be severely punished. And Trofimo Lysenko, his ludicrous ideas led to millions of people starving to death, but it was Holy Writ, it was just above question. And applying this to grammar and so on, Stalin was obviously paranoid, ludicrously intolerant. When someone stated the incontrovertible fact that Finnish had more cases than Russian, person sent to the slave labor camp. So bringing back slavery, sending millions of people to labor camps, so massive scale state terror, often sent to labor camps, 50% of them sent to labor camps with no form of trial whatsoever. And many of the others sent were tried in front of 3 policemen, not in front of a judge, no lawyer, no defense lawyer, not allowed to challenge the case against them. Sometimes they didn't even know the charges, so a Kafkaesque situation. And anyway, using agitation propaganda, communists believing that all the arts had to serve the ideology. That's obviously music, even terpsichoreanism, painting, drawing, architecture, theatre, and so forth. And the 1920s, very bold, avant-garde, and experimental. Anything audacious was applauded, but all had to be refracted through the prism of socialist realism, somehow promoting the Marxist vision. But by the 1930s, a bit of a cultural retreat to more established and classical forms of expression. Indeed, there's an architectural style called Stalinist neoclassical. Okay, so totalitarianism, I mean, it's applicable to religion, to any nationalism. Like St. Ignatius Loyola, who founded the Society of Jesus, i.e. the Jesuits, said, I would believe that black is white if the church told me that. So he'd disbelieve his own eyes. To suspend your critical faculties in a particular area, especially with religion, because it's got an extraordinarily powerful emotional purchase on people. It's really part of your identity. It's about familial identity, communal identity, to some degree national identity, the destiny of the soul, and you've invested so much of your emotion and identity in that. The existential crisis you'd have to confront in realizing that you've been conned, that this belief is a nonsense, is just intolerable. So there's some cognitive dissonance going on there, and people find ways of trying to convince themselves to believe that something that they know on one level is bogus, to convince themselves that it's true. Yeah, obviously communism was viciously anti-religious, although curiously never quite finished off a religion, always left a handful of churches, mosques and synagogues open. But going in for the war on truth, constantly rewriting history. Obviously George Orwell fabulously satirized this in 1984. And you'll see the same thing going on in Putin's Russia today. The FSB is internal intelligence agency, got offices inside of scientific institutions, historical institutions, to try and police ideological correctitude. So insisting on conformity, and they were almost all sort of short back in size, even when it came to clothes and so on, and saying things were abnormal. That was a very harsh criticism indeed. So trying to make the world monochromatic, and massive scale lying about history, falsifying the annals when things didn't suit them, airbrushing people out of histories, obliterating their names. I mean, the Romans had a special word for it. Erasure of historical memory. You'll see in North Korea today with their state newspaper, they never show back issues because you can't see how it's changing or they're contradicting themselves. Sometimes praising insurgents against Tsarism and the ethnic minorities, but sometimes damning the very same people as bourgeois nationalists. They used to quip about the Soviet Union because they believed that Marxism was teleological, that they were living through socialism, going to lead to communism, which was the proletarian paradise. That was it. There was the perfectibility of human society. That was a core principle of theirs. But anyway, so they knew that was going to happen. They'd been scientifically proven by Marx, Lenin, and so on. But they kept rewriting history. So the future was certain, but the past was always changing. That's how nonsensical it was. But going in for the big lie, as Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler said, the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it, because who would have the impudence to tell an massacre perpetrated by the Soviet Union?